Hi, my name is Camille Harris, and I'll be presenting on our work, Exploring the Role of Grammar and Word Choice in Bias Towards African American English and Hate Speech Classification. I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Matan Halevy, Dr. Ayanna Howard, Dr. Amy Bruckman, and Dr. Diyi. To start with some background, African American English is a subset of English used by many Black people in the United States. And most natural language systems do not use much African American English in their training or in their machine learning pipeline. They predominantly rely on Standard American English, which is the dialect most common amongst white Americans. Prior work has provided evidence showing natural language systems have biases towards African American English. This has been found for sentiment analysis, language identification, and hate speech classification. With hate speech classification in particular, the bias is that African American English is more likely to be falsely labeled as hate speech or hateful in some other manner. This bias reinforces notions of anti-Black racism that Black people are inherently violent or hateful, and as such, their dialect of AAE is more likely to be hateful. With this work, we want to explore this bias further and explore aspects of AAE social media data, such as word choice and grammar, to determine the impact of these aspects on hate speech classifications. The research questions guiding this work are: how strongly does the use of swear words or offensive language impact the hate speech classification of AAE text? And how do grammar patterns of AAE tweets impact hate speech classification? These are some of the terms I'll be using throughout this presentation, and some of the terms used as labels in our hate speech classification models. And here are some examples of each of these terms. More information on this can be found in the paper. For our methods, we mainly rely on 3 data sets. Davidson et al. Is a data set of hate speech data labeled for hate, offensive speech, or neither. Founta et al. Is a hate speech data set labeled for hate speech, abusive speech, spam, and none. And Blodgett et al. Is a AVE and Standard English dialect estimation data set where it takes several tweets and estimates dialect for each. And each of these data sets relies on Twitter data. For the models, we predominantly rely on BERT, bidirectional encoder representations from transforms. BERT is considered top of the line for many text classification tasks, and as such, we use it for hate speech, for the hate speech classification models and for the dialect classification models. For each of the hate speech data sets, we trained a BERT hate speech classification model, and we also trained one on the Blodgett et al. AVE data set. And to answer research question 1, we also use Word2Vec trained on the Blodgett data set as well. This is the pipeline of what we've done in this work. For each hate speech data set, we train it on BERT, or we train BERT using these data sets. And once we have a trained model and we have good performance validated by the test data, we apply the model to 3 different subsets of the AAE Blodgett data set. The first being the full data set, next a sample of the data with high concentration of swear words, and next being the sample that the same sample censored using word replacement that I will talk about more in the methods for research question 1. Then for research question 2, we apply this AAE-like grammar dictionary that we created to each of the samples to look more closely at the grammar patterns for research question 2. Before answering our research questions, we wanted to better understand the relationship between AAE and hate speech. So we trained the BERT classifiers on hate speech datasets, as stated earlier, and we used the classifiers to determine the correlation between the hate speech labels and AAE and to determine the false positive rate of hate speech labels and AAE. For the correlation, we saw a relatively high correlation for all but the hate speech label from the Davidson trained model. But for offensive speech, we saw a relatively high correlation. Similarly, for the Fountain model, we saw a relatively high correlation for both hate speech and abusive speech. Next, for false positive rate, we saw, again, a relatively high false positive rate across abusive, offensive, and the Fountain hate speech label. Now, moving on to research question 1, since we have an understanding of these biases, we look to our methods for this research question. First, we train Word2Vec on the Blodgett AAE dataset. Then we create a dictionary of swear words and replacement words sourced from Luke and from linguistic text on AAE. Luke actually is predominantly derived from standard English text from the US and throughout Europe. And so to do this, we needed to heavily supplement for swear words that are more commonly found in AAE, hence the linguistic text here. Then we identify tweets with words that have a high cosine similarity to words in this dictionary, and use the replacement words to reword the tweet. Then we take a sample of the reworded tweets and compare them to the original to ensure that they mostly have the same meaning. And we use the hate speech classifiers on our reworded text. The results for the rewording, we found that there was a significant reduction in all of the labels for the reworded version of the same text. For research question 2, our methods were to create an AAE-like grammar dictionary with words and phrases associated with the 4 grammar categories that are unique to AAE. We identified tweets with words and phrases from each of these categories, and we look at the classifications within the categories. To talk more about the AAE-like grammar dictionary, we focus on 4 grammar categories: auxiliary verbs, spectral markers, preverbal markers, and syntactic and morphosyntactic properties. We rely on these 4 categories in particular because they are consistent across generational and regional variations of AAE. This dialect is highly variable throughout the country and across age ranges, so we wanted to make sure that we use categories that were going to be relatively common across all those variations. We also relied on patterns that are easily distinguishable from standard American English. This is to prevent any accidental standard English tweets from being included in our analysis. And for each category, we identified a list of several words and phrases that are common in AAE and represent these categories. And we consider a tweet to be of a category if it contains at least one of those words or phrases. I want to emphasize that this is not an exhaustive list of the grammar categories in AAE, nor are any of the lists used within the categories exhaustive representations of the full grammar pattern, but it was enough to give us an analysis to give us enough tweets to sample that we can analyze each of these grammar categories. Here are the results displayed for auxiliary verbs. To see the results for all 4 grammar categories, please check out the paper. But the results are very similar across all 4 categories. If you compare the auxiliary verbs category to the full text, you'll find that there's not a significant difference in these grammar categories from the overall classification. So this would imply that these grammar categories don't have much of an impact on the overall classifications here. So to summarize, we find that AAE is more correlated and has a higher false positive rate for each of the labels we looked at: abusive, offensive, and hate speech. We find that rewording tweets to remove swear words reduces the hate speech classification significantly. We were expecting a slightly larger reduction, especially for offensive speech, because that label relies mainly on the word choice. But nonetheless, we found this was effective in reducing those hate speech label classifications. This would imply that for future work, removing swear words before evaluating a tweet for hate speech, especially within AAE, could improve classifications and reduce bias, and also training models on hate speech data with swear words removed so that the models don't rely so strongly on individual words and rather the greater sentiment of the text might also be promising for reducing bias. Lastly, we found that the 4 grammar categories we examined had little impact on the classifications, but we think this deserves further work, especially by a more thorough analysis comparing these grammar categories perhaps to a standard English equivalent to see the true difference there. And that concludes this presentation, and thank you for your time.